What we call stress is often misunderstood. Most people think of it as something purely negative and emotional state, a problem to eliminate. But if we want to be effective in managing and even using stress to our advantage, we have to start with precision. Stress is not an emotion. It's not even a thought. Stress is a biological response, a full body cascade that begins in the brain and ripples out through the nervous system, the endocrine system, and even down to the level of our cells. At its core, stress is the body's way of mobilizing resources in response to a perceived challenge. The word perceived is important here. The threat doesn't have to be real. The body responds to perception, not just reality. That means whether you're running from a predator or preparing for a job interview, the stress response can look nearly identical at the biological level. Elevated heart rate, shifts in respiration, heightened focus. Suppression of non-essential systems like digestion and reproduction. All of this happens automatically, orchestrated by deep, ancient parts of the brain that evolved long before we had language or modern society. The key area that kicks this off is the hypothalamus, a small but critically important structure in the brain. When the hypothalamus detects something it interprets as a challenge, it activates a system known as the hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal axis, or HPA axis. This sets off a hormonal chain reaction that leads to the release of cortisol from the adrenal glands. Alongside that, there's also a near-instantaneous activation of the sympathetic nervous system, what most people know as the fight or flight system. That's when adrenaline floods the body, sharpening alertness, redirecting blood flow to muscles, and priming the brain for fast decision making. Now, all of this sounds dramatic, and it is, but it's not inherently bad. In fact, this system is essential. If you've ever reacted instantly to avoid a car accident, or felt an intense burst of energy before an important event, that's stress doing what it was designed to do. It's mobilizing you, preparing you, making you more capable in the face of challenge. Where we run into problems is when this system stays activated for too long or gets triggered too easily. The stress response was designed for short bursts to get us through a danger, then shut off so the body can recover. But in the modern world, the kinds of stressors we face often don't resolve quickly. We carry them around in our minds, replay them, anticipate them, and the body doesn't know the difference between real-time danger and imagined threat. That means the same systems that helped us survive on the savannah are now being activated while we sit in traffic, check our phones, or lie awake at night thinking about work. What's important to understand is that this isn't a failure of the system. It's the system doing its job in an environment it didn't evolve for. That's why understanding stress as a biological process is so crucial. It lets us take some of the emotion out of it. When we feel stressed, we're not broken, we're not weak, we're experiencing a natural response, and once we know what's happening, we can start to work with it, not against it. There's also an adaptive side to stress that often gets overlooked. Short-term stress, sometimes called acute stress, can actually improve performance. It can enhance memory formation, increase reaction time, and improve immune function. It's only when stress becomes chronic that it turns toxic. Chronic stress that persists for weeks or months without adequate recovery can lead to wear and tear on the body, particularly on the cardiovascular system, the brain, and the immune system. It can shrink key areas of the brain involved in memory and decision making. It can dysregulate sleep, appetite, and mood. But again, this isn't the stress response going wrong, it's the system being overused without enough time to reset. So the first step toward mastering stress is to respect it, to understand that this is not just an emotional or psychological event. It's a physiological shift designed to help us survive and perform. Once we can identify the signs: elevated heart rate, rapid breathing, heightened focus, agitation, we can begin to recognize stress for what it is. A signal that the body is mobilizing, preparing us for action. And that's powerful knowledge, because if we can recognize the pattern, we can intervene, not with willpower alone, but with science, neuroscience-backed tools that allow us to regulate the system at the level of breathing, vision, behavior, and thought. Stress is not the enemy. It's information. It's energy. The real challenge is learning how to work with that energy in ways that support our goals, rather than letting it consume us now that we understand stress as a physiological response. The next layer of this conversation takes us to the wiring of the body, specifically the autonomic nervous system. This system governs all of the automatic functions that keep us alive: heart rate, breathing, digestion, blood pressure, even pupil dilation. You don't have to think about making your heart beat or your lungs expand. That's the autonomic nervous system doing its job. But what's often overlooked is how this system also underlies how we experience stress and how we recover from it. The autonomic nervous system has two primary branches. One is the sympathetic nervous system, the so-called fight or flight branch, and the other is the parasympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for rest and digest functions. These two systems are in constant interplay, constantly adjusting the body's internal state based on what's happening outside and inside. When you encounter something the brain perceives as a threat, a real danger, or even just a deadline or an argument, the sympathetic system ramps up. It signals the adrenal glands to release adrenaline, which instantly increases heart rate and respiration, dilates the pupils, and diverts blood flow away from the digestive system toward the muscles. You're being primed for action, ready to move, run, fight, or focus. At the same time, the parasympathetic system gets dialed down. The body shifts its energy away from long-term processes like digestion, immune function, and even reproduction to deal with the immediate demand. This is efficient biology. It's evolutionary engineering at its finest. The issue, again, is that in modern life, the stressors we face don't often require physical action. We're not running from predators, we're sitting in front of screens. But the body doesn't distinguish between a predator and an angry email. It responds the same way: sympathetic activation, withdrawal of parasympathetic tone. What's interesting and extremely useful is that these two systems are not just passive switches. You can learn to modulate them. You can train yourself to recognize when your sympathetic system is getting too dominant and deliberately activate the parasympathetic system to restore balance. This is one of the most empowering things you can understand about stress. You are not at the mercy of your biology. You can interface with it directly through behavior, breath, and awareness. Let me give you a concrete example. Let's say your heart is racing and your breathing is shallow, clear signs that your sympathetic nervous system is active. If you take a deep inhale followed by a longer exhale, especially if that exhale is slow and extended, you're signaling your parasympathetic system to engage. Why? Because the parasympathetic nerves, especially the vagus nerve, are connected to the diaphragm and respond to specific patterns of breath. Longer exhalations, particularly when done deliberately, send a message to the brain and body: things are safe, it's okay to slow down. There are also visual and postural cues. When we're stressed, we tend to narrow our vision, a tunnel vision effect. This is driven by sympathetic activation. When we deliberately widen our gaze, soften the eyes, and take in the entire visual field, what's called panoramic vision, we are tapping into a mode of perception that supports calmness and increased parasympathetic tone. The body takes that in as a cue that the threat has passed or that no immediate action is needed. These aren't just relaxation techniques, these are interventions based on how the autonomic nervous system actually functions. Now, it's also important to understand that you don't want to live entirely in parasympathetic mode. That would mean low energy, low responsiveness, minimal readiness to act. The goal isn't to eliminate sympathetic activation, it's to balance it. To be able to rise to the challenge when needed and to downshift into recovery when the challenge has passed. People who perform at high levels, whether in athletics, leadership, or creative fields, tend to be those who can make that shift with precision. They ramp up when it's go time, and they recover quickly and deeply when it's over. That's autonomic control. There's also a timing component here. The periods of sympathetic activation followed by periods of parasympathetic recovery. But in our world, we often get stuck in a chronic sympathetic state. Constant notifications, connectedness, stimulation late at night, all of this keeps us in that wired, reactive mode. And if the body doesn't get time in parasympathetic mode, that's when stress becomes damaging. It starts to degrade sleep, impair digestion, weaken the immune system, and wear down the brain. So the question becomes, are you giving your nervous system enough time and space to recover? Are you building in moments during your day, even 60 seconds at a time, to deliberately trigger the parasympathetic system? You don't need to wait until vacation to downshift. You can take control of these systems in real time. You can use breath, vision, and posture to shape your state, not just your state of mind, but your actual physiological condition. Understanding how the autonomic nervous system works gives you the power to influence your own biology. That's not a metaphor. That's real, observable, measurable science. You have the ability to regulate your stress response and, in doing so, shape how you perform, recover, and adapt under pressure. When we talk about stress, we have to go beyond the nervous system and look at what's happening chemically, what's happening at the level of hormones. Because the brain doesn't just send electrical signals to the body, it also sends chemical messengers into the bloodstream that orchestrate a whole body response. Two of the main players in the stress response are adrenaline and cortisol. Understanding how these work is essential if we want to regulate stress in a way that protects health and enhances performance. Let's start with adrenaline, also known as epinephrine. This is the fast-acting hormone. The moment your brain detects something challenging or threatening, it signals the adrenal medulla, part of the adrenal glands that sit just above your kidneys, to dump adrenaline into the bloodstream. The effect is almost immediate. Heart rate increases, breathing becomes quicker and shallower, blood gets diverted from your digestive organs to your muscles, your pupils dilate, your awareness sharpens. You become laser, focused on whatever triggered the response. This is the classic fight or flight response. Adrenaline is what gives you that jolt of energy when a car swerves in your lane or when you hear a sudden noise in the dark. It's your body's way of saying, be ready, but adrenaline doesn't last long. It's designed for short-term bursts. It hits fast, helps you react, and then begins to wear off, assuming the situation resolves. But if the perceived threat continues, or if it's psychological and ongoing, like financial pressure or chronic workload, another hormone comes into play, cortisol. Cortisol is released a little more slowly, but its effects are much longer lasting. It comes from a different part of the adrenal gland, the adrenal cortex, and it's controlled by the HPA axis, the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and adrenal cortex working together in a loop. When your brain continues to detect threat or challenge, it initiates this cascade. The hypothalamus releases CRH, corticotropin-releasing hormone, which signals the pituitary to release actadrena-corticotropic hormone, which finally tells the adrenal cortex to release cortisol into the bloodstream. Cortisol is often labeled as the stress hormone, but that's an oversimplification. Cortisol isn't bad. In fact, you need it. It helps regulate blood sugar. It helps you stay awake and alert. It supports memory formation and immune function in the short term. Without cortisol, you wouldn't be able to function in high-pressure situations. Like adrenaline, cortisol is only helpful when it's deployed in the right amounts at the right time. When cortisol levels remain elevated for too long, that's when problems begin. Chronic elevation of cortisol can damage brain areas responsible for memory, learning, and emotional regulation, especially the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex. It can also suppress the immune system, disrupt sleep, and lead to accumulation of visceral fat around the organs. It creates a physiological state of being constantly mobilized, constantly on edge, without any true resolution. That's not what these systems were designed for. They were meant to help us face acute challenges, then shut off and allow recovery. One important detail here is that cortisol follows a natural rhythm in the body. It's supposed to be highest in the early part of the day, helping you wake up, focus, and start your activity. and then taper off as evening approaches, allowing for rest and sleep. When stress becomes chronic or mistimed, it disrupts this natural rhythm. You might feel wired at night, tired in the morning, unable to fall asleep, or waking up in the middle of the night with your mind racing. That's often a cortisol issue, and it's not solved just by thinking differently. It has to be addressed at the biological level. Here's something useful. Your behaviors influence your hormone levels. When you expose your body to consistent, predictable patterns of activity and recovery, you shape your hormonal profile. For example, viewing bright natural light in the early part of the day helps anchor your cortisol rhythm. It reinforces the message to your brain, this is daytime, this is alertness. Likewise, avoiding bright artificial light late at night, especially overhead light and blue light from screens, helps keep cortisol low and allows melatonin to rise, preparing you for sleep. Physical exercise also plays a critical role. When done at the right intensity and time of day, exercise can act as a controlled stressor. It elevates cortisol temporarily, but then allows for a rebound drop, a reset. This teaches the system how to ramp up and recover efficiently. Deliberate cold exposure, like cold showers or ice baths, works in a similar way, triggering a spike in adrenaline and cortisol, followed by a deep state of calm and focus once the stressor is removed. It's all about balance. We don't want zero cortisol. We want the right cortisol at the right time. We don't want to shut down adrenaline. We want to harness it when needed, then return to baseline quickly. The ability to control these hormonal responses is what gives us control over how we perform under pressure, how we recover, and ultimately how resilient we become over time. When we look at stress not just in the moment, but over time, its effects become even more profound and more important. Understand, because acute stress, as we've discussed, can be useful. It helps you focus, mobilize energy, and respond to challenges. But when stress becomes chronic, when there's no real recovery, that same system that helps us survive can begin to work against us. And it does so in very specific and measurable ways, especially in the brain and body. Let's start with the brain. One of the key regions involved in the stress response is the amygdala. This is the part of the brain that detects threats like the body's surveillance system. When stress is frequent or prolonged, the amygdala becomes more reactive. It starts to detect threats more easily, even in situations that might not be threatening at all. In a very real sense, the brain starts to shift toward a more defensive mode, where danger is assumed rather than evaluated. This can lead to chronic anxiety, hypervigilance, and a narrowed ability to stay calm and focused. Now here's where it gets even more interesting. The amygdala has direct influence over the hypothalamus, which controls the hormonal cascade we talked about earlier, the HPA axis. So as the amygdala becomes more reactive, it drives more cortisol production, and that, in turn, affects other areas of the brain, most notably the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. The hippocampus is essential for learning and memory. It's also involved in putting context around stressful experiences, helping you determine whether something is truly dangerous or not. Chronic stress and elevated cortisol levels can actually shrink the hippocampus. It reduces the number of new neurons being formed and impairs synaptic plasticity, the ability of brain circuits to adapt and learn. This is one of the reasons why memory and focus tend to decline when people are under long-term stress. The prefrontal cortex is another critical area. It's responsible for executive functions like decision making, planning, emotional regulation, and impulse control. Under stress, the prefrontal cortex becomes less active. Its function gets suppressed, while more primitive, reactive systems take over. This is helpful in a life or death scenario where split-second reactions matter more than complex reasoning, but in everyday life, this shift can be harmful. It makes it harder to regulate your emotions, harder to make thoughtful decisions, and easier to act impulsively or irrationally. So, under chronic stress, we see a kind of rewiring. The brain becomes more reactive, less flexible, and less capable of regulating its own state. This doesn't just change how you feel, it changes how you think, how you interpret the world, and how you behave. Now, let's look at what's happening in the body over time. Chronic stress affects nearly every major system. Cardiovascular system, for example, is directly influenced by stress hormones. Cortisol and adrenaline increase blood pressure and heart rate. If this happens occasionally, it's not a problem. But if it happens continuously, day after day, it puts wear and tear on the arteries, increases inflammation, and raises the risk of heart disease and stroke. Stress also impacts the immune system. Initially, short-term stress can actually enhance immune function. But when stress becomes chronic, cortisol begins to suppress the immune response. You may notice it as getting sick more often, wounds healing more slowly, or an increase in inflammatory conditions. Inflammation is the body's defense system, but when it stays active for too long, it becomes destructive. It contributes to chronic diseases, accelerates aging, and disrupts the body's ability to repair itself. Even your metabolism changes under stress. Cortisol promotes the storage of fat, particularly in the visceral region, the deep fat around the organs. This is not just an aesthetic issue. It's a major risk factor for metabolic disorders like insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. Chronic stress also alters appetite, regulating hormones like ghrelin and leptin, which can lead to overeating, cravings for high sugar foods, and disrupted eating patterns. Sleep is another major area affected by long-term stress. Elevated cortisol in the evening interferes with the production of melatonin, the hormone that signals the body to wind down. That means it becomes harder to fall asleep, stay asleep, and reach deep, restorative sleep stages. And of course, lack of quality sleep increases cortisol the next day, which creates a vicious cycle of stress and sleep disruption. The point here is not to create fear, but to build awareness. Stress, if unmanaged, doesn't just affect how we feel today. It shapes the structure and function of the brain. It shifts how the body regulates energy, repairs itself, and maintains health. And all of this accumulates. That's why it's so important to understand that stress is not just psychological. It's physiological. It changes your biology, your cognition, and your behavior over time. But, and this is key, just as the brain and body adapt to chronic stress, they can also adapt in the opposite direction. Neuroplasticity works both ways. With the right interventions, consistent sleep, breathwork, light exposure, exercise, deliberate decompression practices, we can rewire the system toward resilience, toward clarity, toward recovery. The changes caused by stress are reversible, but they don't reverse themselves. They respond to action.